Hello and welcome to the second of this week's videos, and in this video we will be taking a look at a very famous thought experiment by Harry Frankfurt, and also at his own positive account of compatibilist freedom. So Harry Frankfurt, in this very influential paper from 1969, has proposed a thought experiment that was designed to show that we do not need the power to do otherwise in order to be free, or how you would call it, that the principle of alternative possibilities is not a prerequisite for freedom. And if we can show that, then in a sense we can sidestep the famous consequence argument. So if you remember, the consequence argument was supposed to be this master argument for incompatibilism, so the view that freedom and determinism are not compatible. But if we're now able to show that we can be free even if we do not have the power to do otherwise, then the conclusion of the consequence argument, right, that if determinism is true, there's nothing I can now do to change the fact that our present actions occur, that conclusion then sort of loses its sting. And that's the whole point behind this type of argument, right? So before we go on and discuss the a famous thought experiment by Harry Frankfurt, we need to be careful. If we have taken a look at Frankfurt's paper, you see that Frankfurt discusses the thought experiment in terms of moral responsibility and not necessarily in terms of freedom. So his thought experiment is designed to show that we don't need the power to do otherwise, or this principle of alternative possibilities, for moral responsibility and not necessarily for freedom. So why then do we discuss this thought experiment so widely in the free will debate, and why do I discuss it now, and why did I introduce it as an argument, as a thought experiment that is supposed to show that we don't need the power to do otherwise in order to be free? Well, I do so because moral responsibility and freedom are very closely connected. In a sense, we can say that freedom is a necessary condition for moral responsibility. We cannot be morally responsible for our actions if they're not free, right? So there are no actions for which we are morally responsible that aren't free. But if it is possible, as Frankfurt argues in his paper, that we can be morally responsible without freedom, without having the power to do otherwise, and then that means that we can be free without having the power to do otherwise, right? So that's the whole point. Freedom is a prerequisite for moral responsibility. So whenever we're morally responsible for our actions, then we are also free. We can be morally responsible without having the power to do otherwise. Hence, we can also be free without having the power to do otherwise. So that's why this type of thought experiment has been so widely discussed in the free will debate. Let's adapt this famous thought experiment to fit our cases of me sitting in a restaurant with my friends and deciding what to eat for dessert. So again, imagine I'm sitting in a restaurant and I'm deliberating whether I order mousse au chocolat or ice cream for dessert. What I don't know in this scenario, in this thought experiment, is that there has been an evil neuroscientist, again by this infamous Sunday Liberation Army, who has, unbeknownst to me, implanted a chip into my brain. And now this chip monitors my brain functions, it monitors my thoughts, it knows when I'm about to form a desire, and it can change my desires, and then it can make me do things, all without me noticing, right? I don't notice that this is going on. I don't even know that I have this chip in my brain. Now, the chip is set up in a way that it wants me to order ice cream, and it does so very subtly. Right? If I'm about to order ice cream on my own behalf, because I just want ice cream, the chip recognizes my desire to eat ice cream, and it doesn't intervene at all. It just monitors the brain functions, but it doesn't do anything. So I then go about and order ice cream, and everything's good, right? But if now the chip notices that I'm about to do anything but order ice cream in this scenario, namely, for example, order mousse au chocolat, then the chip reads my brain state, sees that I'm about to form this desire to order mousse au chocolat, and then it intervenes, and then it changes my desire, and it makes me want to eat ice cream, and it makes me order ice cream. So the chip only intervenes in the cases where I'm about to do something that the chip is designed to prevent. So what does this mean now for freedom? In both cases, I end up eating ice cream, and I end up wanting ice cream. So I do not have the power to do otherwise. I cannot do otherwise but order and eat ice cream. But still, in both possible cases, the one where the chip intervenes and the one where it doesn't, there seems to be a difference between these two cases, right? If the chip intervenes and makes me want and order ice cream, I'm clearly not free. I'm being manipulated, right? The chip is the thing that changes my desires, that changes my deliberative mechanism, and makes me want to do things. But what about the case then where I'm ordering ice cream because that's what I wanted to do all along, and the chip doesn't intervene? Frankfurt asked, wouldn't we say in this case that the agent is more responsible and hence free for that action? Because the chip didn't do anything, right? It just sat in the background, monitored my brain functions, but didn't change anything at all. So if I can be more responsible for my action to eat ice cream because I want to eat ice cream, and hence I can be free in that decision, then in this case, Frankfurt argues we should say that I am free. But crucially, I do not have the power to do otherwise. So this is what his argument is about, right? He has shown us that there could be cases in which we would say that the agent is free, but the agent does not have the power to do otherwise. And that's exactly what he needs, right? This is supposed to be an argument against the view that freedom or moral responsibility requires the power to do otherwise. And if we can find one case in which the agent is free but doesn't have the power to do otherwise, then we have shown that that isn't the case, right? That we need freedom, that we need the power to do otherwise for freedom. And that's exactly what he's done here, right? He's shown us one case in which we can be free but don't have the power to do otherwise, and hence the power to do otherwise is not a necessary condition for freedom. Having discussed this famous thought experiment to the effect that we don't need the power to do otherwise for freedom, let's now turn to his own view of freedom. So what we've done so far is we've just discussed what he thinks isn't a necessary condition for freedom. What is then a necessary condition for freedom, you might ask? So what is his own view of freedom? And Frankfurt is a compatibilist, and his view is that we are free if our first and second order desires align, and we're not free if they do not align. What does that mean? What are first order desires? What are second order desires? What does alignment mean? First order desires are what he calls desires for ordinary objects. Now, ordinary objects we should understand in a very, very broad sense. We're not talking about like physical ordinary objects like mugs and tables and chairs, right? We're talking about a desire to do something. The desire that immediately causes the action, the desire that immediately precedes the action. If I want to eat ice cream, the first order desire is the desire to eat ice cream. If I want to study philosophy, right, the first order desire here is the desire to study philosophy. What is a second order desire now? A second order desire is a desire about which first order desire I want to be motivated by. That might sound complex, but it really isn't. It's just whether or not I endorse my first order desire, right? If I have the first order desire to eat ice cream, do I have the desire that basically, am I happy with my desire to eat ice cream? Or do I want to have different desires, right? So that's what he means now. If I endorse my first order desires with my second order desires, if I'm happy about my desires, then I'm free. If I don't endorse them, then I'm not free. Crucially now, this view does not require any form of indeterminism, right? It doesn't require that we have the power to do otherwise, that we can freely and undetermined choose between two different types of intentions to act, right? Without being determined by the beginning of the universe and the state of the universe at the beginning of time and the laws of nature, right? It doesn't tell us anything about that at all. This view is completely compatible with what our first and second order desires are to be determined by the initial state of the universe and the laws of nature. It just tells us you're free if you want to do what you do and if you endorse that desire. That's everything. So how can we now tell whether this is a good view of freedom? Well, one method that we often employ in these cases when we want to figure out whether a particular theory is a good fit for reality, we apply this theory to paradigmatic cases. So to cases in which we sort of know what the answer should be, right? Cases where, for example, the agent is clearly free or is clearly not free, and we apply the theory and we see whether it gives us the right result. And in this case, let's take a look at cases where this theory of compatibilist freedom that Harry Frankfurt has excuses the agent, where this theory says that the agent isn't free and that the agent isn't morally responsible for their actions. And let's see whether it gives us the right result here. So clearly this view excuses any type of coercion, right? Because or the agent behavior in any type of coercion, right? Because in a type where you're coerced to act, your first and second order desires do not align. So all is fine and dandy here, right? If somebody storms the restaurant right when I'm about to make the choice between ice cream and mousse au chocolat, holds a gun to my head and makes me eat ice cream, although I wanted to eat mousse au chocolat, I might have the first order desire to eat ice cream because I want to survive, but I do not endorse this desire, right? I don't endorse that at all because I wanted to do something differently in the first place. So cases of coercion are being excused. So if the agent is coerced, they're not free and they're not morally responsible, according to Frankfurt's view, and that seems to be the right result, right? So that's all good. Frankfurt also says that we should excuse the agent in cases of compulsive behavior, such as unwanted addiction or obsessive compulsive behavior. Now, obsessive compulsive behavior is fairly straightforward, right? Let's say you have this compulsion to this compulsive behavior to always check whether your door is locked, multiple times before you leave the house. So you're about to leave the house, lock the door behind you, you walk a couple of steps and then you turn back, check again whether you locked the door, begin walking again, turn back again, and so forth, right? In this case, you might have the first order desire in any of these cases to go back and check whether the door is actually locked, but you know that this is obsessive compulsive behavior and you don't want your everyday life to be dictated by this obsessive compulsive behavior. So in these cases, your first and your second order desires do not align, right? You do not endorse your first order desire to always go back and check the door. So in this case, the agent is excused, and we would say that the agent isn't free and it's not morally responsible for their actions. And that seems to be the right result, right? In cases where the agent acts under some form of obsessive compulsive behavior, we tend to excuse their behavior a bit, right? Either entirely or at least we say they're not as free as in other cases. So the theory gives us again the right result here. Crucially, Frankfurt thinks the same should also apply for addiction, at least when I don't want to be addicted. And this is a bit more controversial. There's a lot of voices in the debate that say that we shouldn't excuse agents that are addicted, and we shouldn't say that they're not free. But at least Frankfurt thinks that we should, and his view gives us the right result here again, right? Because if I'm, for example, addicted to ice cream, I might have this first order desire to eat ice cream all the time, and I go and eat ice cream. But my second order desire in this case would be that maybe I don't want to be addicted to ice cream. I know that it is unhealthy to eat ice cream all the time. So when my first order desire causes me to eat ice cream, my second order desire might not endorse this. So according to Frankfurt, this also is a case where we're not free, and where we're not morally responsible for our actions. And also, this view gives us the right kind of result in cases where we have deviant causal paths. Like, for example, when there is an evil scientist who implanted a chip into my brain. Right? In this case, clearly, I might have the first order desire to order ice cream, because that is, and I then go about and order ice cream because that is the desire that it was implanted into me by the chip. But I don't have a second order desire that endorses implanted desires, right? I don't want to be driven by desires that have been implanted into my brain by this chip. So again, in this case, Frankfurt's view of the second and first order desires tells us that the agent isn't free, and that is, again, at first sight at least, the correct result for these cases. Now, before we go on and discuss some counterexamples, I'd like to take a step back, because Frankfurt's text is quite complex, but it is also very influential. So I've uploaded it to Moodle. It's one of the readings for this week, and if you're reading it, you might be confused, because Frankfurt uses three terms and distinguishes between these three terms. But in the way that he does it, that might be confusing, because he distinguishes between acting of one's own free will and having freedom of will, and he thinks those are not the same. And if you don't know that he thinks that those are not the same, then it might be confusing reading his text, right? It might be confusing to say that he thinks that we're acting for our own free will, but we don't have freedom of will. What does he mean by that? And obviously he has this notion of moral responsibility. So just to help you read Frankfurt's original text, let us explain what these terms mean. And this is a reconstruction by Helen Beebe, which is hugely helpful if you want to read the original text by Harry Frankfurt. So what is acting of one's own free will? Acting of one's own free will is just this notion of freedom that he proposes, right? Alignment of first and second order desires. That is his view of compatibilist freedom, right? That is his compatibilist notion of freedom. Having freedom of will is something different in his view, right? He uses that term differently. He says having freedom of will means having the power to set your will otherwise. That is incompatibilist freedom, right? That is an incompatibilist notion of freedom, because this requires that we have the power to do otherwise. And he says this is a kind of freedom that we do not have. So when he says that we can act of our own free will, but that we don't have freedom of will, what he means by that is that we have this compatibilist freedom, but we do not have this incompatibilist freedom. And for moral responsibility, he thinks compatibilist freedom is enough. If we can act of our own free will, and that means that our first and second order desires align, then we are morally responsible. Moral responsibility does not require that we have this stronger notion of freedom, this incompatibilist freedom that he calls having freedom of will. So just to clear up, again, acting of one's own free will, that is freedom in the compatibilist sense. That's the freedom that he thinks we have. Having freedom of will, that is his word, his term for incompatibilist freedom, and that's the kind of freedom that he thinks we don't have. And for moral responsibility, we only need this compatibilist notion, acting of one's own free will. So I added this slide here because I realized that reading his original text can be a bit confusing, because he doesn't clearly tell us what he means with these terms. So this is why this reconstruction by Helen Beebe is so immensely helpful. So having cleared that up, let us very briefly take a look at two arguments against Frankfurt's view. One against his thought experiment, and one against his positive account of freedom, before we wrap up for this particular video. The argument against his thought experiment is the so-called flicker of freedom response that we'll discuss, and the argument against his positive account of freedom is the argument that it doesn't cover all paradigmatic cases, that there are some paradigmatic cases where his theory gives us the wrong result. So let's start with the flickers of freedom response. That is designed to show us that his thought experiment doesn't show what it's supposed to show, and it goes like this. Remember what the thought experiment was, right? The thought experiment was that I was having that somebody implanted this chip into my brain that monitored my brain states and altered my brain states in cases where it wanted to, or where it was programmed to bring about a certain result. Now, in this case, the chip was designed to make me order ice cream. And in any case where I am about to order something different, the chip intervenes. But in order to be able to intervene, this is how the argument now goes, it needs to be able to pick up that I'm about to order mousse au chocolat, right? And because if I order ice cream on my own accord, the chip doesn't intervene. It only intervenes when it sees that I'm about to be doing something differently. But that means, so say the critics of this thought experiment, that my brain has already initiated the decision in this case, or action in this case, to order mousse au chocolat. Because if it hadn't, the chip wouldn't have even been able to intervene, because the chip needs to see, oh, the agent is about to order mousse au chocolat, better stop him and make him order ice cream. And what the critics now say is that this isn't already an attempt to do otherwise. When I'm already preparing the action of ordering mousse au chocolat, I attempted to do otherwise. The chip just stopped me in my attempt. And that is what they call this flicker of freedom. There was this brief nanosecond in which my brain was about to form the desire to order ice cream, and then the chip intervened and it made me there was this brief nanosecond where my brain was about to order mousse au chocolat, and the chip saw that, intervened, and made me want and order ice cream. And what the critics now say is that this is a weak form of the power to do otherwise. The agent did have the power to do otherwise. At least the agent had the power to attempt doing otherwise. It's just that this attempt was interrupted. But if we accept that as a weak form of the power to do otherwise, then the example doesn't show that we don't need the power to do otherwise in order to be free, right? If you remember, all this this thought experiment by Harry Frankfurt was supposed to show is that there can be cases in which we would say that the agent is free, but the agent did not have the power to do otherwise. According to this flicker of freedom response, the agent did have the power to do otherwise. So according to the critics, the thought experiment did not show what it was designed to show. We can talk about this flicker of freedom response if you want in the classes and in the live lecture, but let's now turn to another argument against his positive view of freedom, namely his view that we're free if our first and second order desires to act align. And the argument now is that this view doesn't cover all paradigmatic cases, and in particular the cases that it doesn't cover are cases of acrasia, or weakness of will. So acrasia is just a fancy Greek term for weakness of will. Let's take a look at one particular acratic case. I have gained a few pounds during lockdown and I want to lose them again. I want to become a bit fitter, so I want to do more exercise, go out running, but the problem is my couch is very comfy, so often I stay on the couch. Right? I'm weak-willed in that sense. So in these cases, my first order desire, in the cases where I do end up staying on the couch, my first order desire in this case is to stay on the couch, right? Because that is the desire that causes the action. My second order desire, however, doesn't align with this. I don't want to be slacker. I want to go out running. I want to be fitter. I don't want to hang around on my couch. So my second order desire does not endorse my first order desire to stay on the couch. According to Frankfurt's view, we would have to say that in this case, I'm not morally responsible for staying on the couch, and hence I'm also not free for staying on the couch. And this doesn't seem intuitive, right? It doesn't seem right. We want to blame people for being slackers, for having weakness of will. And in fact, we do blame ourselves, right, in these cases often. And we would say this is not a case in which the agent wasn't free. The agent was just weak, in a sense, right? So according to this argument, for these type of cases, for acrasia, for weakness of will, Frankfurt's view gives us the wrong kind of result. It tells us that in these cases the agent is not free, whereas we would say they are free, right? So it doesn't cover these cases well. Let's take a step back from Frankfurt. We've learned about his very famous thought experiment, and we've learned about his positive view of compatibilist freedom. Now there are so many more views that we could discuss that we don't have the time to. There are so many more compatibilist, incompatibilist, semi-compatibilist cases out there, or views out there, that we just don't have the time to discuss. But what I wanted to pull attention to was these two very famous arguments, the consequence argument and Frankfurt's thought experiment, because a lot of the current literature in some way answers to these two arguments, to the consequence argument and to Frankfurt-style cases. And we've seen two positive views about freedom, one libertarian view, Harry Keynes, and one compatibilist view, Robert Keynes and Harry Frankfurt's, that were designed to deal with these two very famous arguments. So at this point, you would say, yes, we've learned a lot about the philosophical side of the debate, but isn't freedom, the debate about freedom, a debate in which we want to also take into account what the empirical sciences tell us? Because neuroscience, psychology, they might have something to say about whether we're free or not. So what do they say about whether we're free or not? And in fact, there are some very influential experiments, for example, that have been taken to show that we're not free, that we're not free agents, free authors of our own actions. And we'll take a look at one very famous such experiment, the Libet experiment, in the next video. So I hope to be seeing you all there.